The USS Odyssey had been in deeper space than this before, and it showed in the easy boredom that had settled across the command deck like a familiar coat. Major General Jack O'Neill sat in the briefing room with his feet propped on the table, and the look of a man who had stopped listening approximately 8 minutes ago. The debrief was winding down. An ancient outpost, some kind of inert crystalline device, recovered from a planet that had made itself extinct in the usual ways. SG-1 had retrieved the artifact. The artifact was now in containment. By every operational metric, the mission was done. Across the table, Lieutenant Colonel Cameron Mitchell was explaining to Vala Maldoran why the recovered device was not a weapon. Vala was explaining back to him with some patience why that was exactly what someone who had never used one as a weapon would say. The argument had been going for 35 minutes and had the easy rhythm of something that would continue until someone changed the subject or the ship dropped out of hyperspace, whichever happened first. Down in the science bay, Lieutenant Colonel Samantha Carter had already moved past the debrief entirely. The Asgard computer core hummed at her back while she ran a secondary diagnostic on the sensor array, her attention divided across 3 screens and a datapad balanced on her knee. The core had been integrated for 6 months and was still occasionally surprising. Not malfunctioning. Just large in a way that rewarded patience. Teal stood his post outside the briefing room in the way he always stood a post. Completely still, completely present, giving nothing away about what he was thinking. He was thinking that the quiet moments were the ones that changed. Daniel Jackson was in his quarters with a tablet from 3 missions back, puzzling through what appeared to be a base 12 counting system, which was genuinely interesting, and was reaching for a stylus to note it when the lights flickered. Once. Then the Odyssey shuddered. Not a weapon impact. Not a hyperspace transition. The sensation moved through the hull, from bow to stern in a long, slow ripple, as if something had taken hold of the ship's nose and pulled, and the readings on Carter's screens changed in 3 separate ways. Then every display went dark. 52 seconds, she would confirm the figure later from the log. 52 seconds in which the instruments recorded nothing and the ship traveled through something that was not normal space, not a wormhole, not a Stargate event horizon, and not anything she had a name for. When the power came back and the screens rebuilt themselves and the hull was still intact and everyone aboard was still breathing, she was already running the diagnostic before the conscious thought caught up to the reflex. Carter. O'Neill's voice on the comm had the particular flatness that meant he had already decided something was wrong and was waiting for someone to confirm it. What was that? Running it now, sir? She was. We have a new star field. A pause. Define new. She was looking at the stellar cartography overlay the Asgard core was building from the rebooted array. She ran a comparative match against the database. No result. She expanded the search parameters and ran it again. Still no result. The Asgard had spent tens of thousands of years cataloging most of the observable universe. An absence in that database did not happen by accident. Sir, she said, keeping her voice level, I need you on the bridge. When he arrived, she pulled up the display without preamble and let him look at it. O'Neill stood at the forward console and studied the star field and the comparative overlay and the notation that read, NO matching region found. He stood there for a moment. No Stargate network, she said. No Naquadah signatures anywhere in sensor range. Nothing on any Goa'uld Ancient or Asgard frequency. The core has been running cartographic comparison since the reboot. It has no record of this configuration. None. Daniel had appeared beside O'Neill without anyone noting exactly when he had arrived on the bridge. He looked at the display for 2 seconds. He said, We're not in our galaxy. "How far out?" O'Neill said. Carter said, "Not far out, a different galaxy." The silence lasted the time it took everyone present to understand what that meant. No Stargate network. No gate addresses that would ever resolve here, because there was no network to connect to. The Odyssey had used its intergalactic hyperdrive before, and had made the run to Pegasus and knew exactly what different galaxy sensor readings looked like. This was not Pegasus. TLC had entered the bridge and stood at the edge of the group. He looked at the display and said nothing. Among them all, he was the one most practiced at facing losses from which no obvious path home existed. "There's something else," Carter said. She brought the secondary display forward. Energy signatures, large ones. Capital-class power readings, dozens of them spread across several star systems, and beneath those, something larger still. City-scale power generation, sustained output, a civilization operating at a level legible from this distance. "We are not alone in this galaxy. Whoever is here is very well equipped," Mitchell, who had come in after Teal, said. "So we knocked on the wrong door." The forward sensor alarm cut him off before O'Neill could answer. 12 contacts. Small, fast, single-pilot craft with a twin-engine silhouette the Asgard database had no classification for. They came out of the dark in tight wing formation, without decelerating and without broadcasting any signal the core could decode. The first salvo struck the Odyssey's shields in a wash of green energy that lit the bridge displays amber. The shields did not strain. The Asgard shielding absorbed the entire salvo at a cost, Carter could measure in fractions, and the energy profile of the incoming fire told her something specific. These weapons were capable, real in their destructive potential, the kind of thing that would dismember an unshielded vessel. But they were not in the tier that threatened a hull. Backed by an Asgard power core, standard protocol, O'Neill said. "Do not fire first. We're guests," Vala said. "They are quite literally shooting at us. Guests who've been shot at before," O'Neill said. The second salvo came in heavier. 4 fighters had tightened their approach angle, and the combined fire registered a 2-point shield drain, 98%, still well inside any margin that mattered. But the intent was no longer ambiguous. "Carter," O'Neill said. "1, make it instructive." She picked the lead fighter. 1 Asgard plasma beam pulse. The discharge crossed the intervening distance faster than any evasive maneuver the pilot could have initiated, and there was no such thing as a warning shot from an Asgard weapon if you wanted to be believed. The beam struck the forward fuselage of the craft, and the fighter divided cleanly in two, both sections spinning silently in opposite directions through the dark in a long, slowing arc. The wings scattered. All 11 remaining craft burned hard for distance and broke formation, every pilot making individual choices that added up to the same collective conclusion. None of them had ever seen a weapon do that. On the long-range sensor, something else had already seen the exchange and was moving toward them at a measured, deliberate pace. 1 contact, very large. "Star Destroyer," Carter said. "Imperial class, approximately 1.6 kilometers bow to stern, deflector shields, multiple turbolaser batteries, and a tractor beam array that is already cycling up." She paused. "Shields are at 95%. Their weapons are getting through the outer layer, but not deeply." The Star Destroyer's batteries opened fire, long red-orange streaks at the Odyssey's forward quarter, the energy of each blast registering on the shield readout in sequence. 93, 92, 91. The Asgard core was not working hard. O'Neill stood at the forward display, and looked at the Star Destroyer the way he had looked at every Goa'uld mothership he had ever encountered, which was with the particular patience of a man taking inventory of an enemy rather than being intimidated by one. He had spent 10 years lifting the hardware off gods. Every time, without exception, he had found the mechanism behind the myth. They always looked formidable from the outside. That was always the point. I know what this is. Mitchell said, "Sir." O'Neill said, "Different flags, same song, real quick. Before we get into this, because I have to know, which character do you want to see go absolutely feral in a universe that has no idea what's about to hit it? Drop the name in the comments." All right, here we go. The Star Destroyer had not retreated. O'Neill watched the capital ship hold its position at the edge of weapons range. Turbolaser batteries still hot on the Odyssey's sensor readout, and understood exactly what it was doing. At this distance it could have fired its full complement. It had not. The shots it had landed were ranging, fire, testing, calibrating, probing. Not an execution, a collection attempt. "They want us alive," he said. Mitchell said, "How are you getting that from them shooting at us? If they wanted us dead, we'd be having a different conversation, or no conversation." O'Neill did not look away from the tactical display. "They want the ship. This is a Goa'uld move. New galaxy, same playbook." Carter said, "They are deploying a tractor beam." "Let them." She looked at him. "Let them get close enough to think it's working," he said. She understood. She pulled up the weapons console and ran targeting on the Star Destroyer's shield array. Asgard plasma beams were not turbolasers. They did not share the same physics, the same frequency range, or the same design assumptions. Imperial deflector shields had been engineered against one threat profile, refined across decades of interfaction conflict, in a galaxy that had never encountered coherent plasma at Asgard output levels. What the Imperial engineers had built was very good. It was not good enough for this. The first pulse hit the Star Destroyer's forward shield array and punched through in under a second. The second hit the aft array before the Imperial crew had registered the first impact. The third hit the junction emitter between them, and the aft shield array went dark. Carter held fire. 4 seconds of silence on both ships. O'Neill keyed the comm. "We want to talk," he said. "Stop pointing things at us." The tractor beam went offline. The Star Destroyer's remaining batteries stayed at bearing but did not fire. It was, O'Neill thought, the most productive conversation he had ever had in a language neither party actually shared. "They're holding," Mitchell said. "Good." O'Neill turned to Carter. "Now ask them something they don't have an answer for." She had already been working it. The Asgard beaming system could lock a target through most shielding. The deflectors that had failed to stop 3 plasma pulses were not going to stop a transporter lock. She had been scanning the Star Destroyer's bridge for the last 90 seconds, cataloging biosignatures, ranking them by position and movement, officers at stations. A command structure, visible in the spatial distribution of where the bodies stood. She selected 3. The beaming sequence took 0.3 seconds. 3 Imperial bridge officers materialized in the Odyssey's cargo bay, standing upright, unhurt, still holding what they had been holding when they disappeared. One had a data pad. One had a mug of something warm. They stood in a room that was not the bridge of their ship, and the objects were still in their hands, and none of them moved. On the Star Destroyer's bridge, 3 positions at the command stations were empty. No blast marks. No hull breach. The deflector shields were still up. Aft array dark, but forward shields holding. And through those shields, 3 of their people had simply ceased to exist in the room they had been standing in. The Imperial crew was silent for 40 seconds. Then they retreated to the edge of the sensor envelope and did not advance. O'Neill stood at the cargo bay door and looked at the three officers through the reinforced panel. They were human, or close to it. Grey uniforms, rank insignia. He did not recognize the posture of people trained to project composure and currently failing at it in the specific way that meant they were not faking the composure, they were failing to project. The officer with the datapad had set it down on the floor with enormous care, as if that were the most reasonable response available. None of them were injured. "Daniel," O'Neill said over the cargo bay. He arrived in 4 minutes with his recorder running, and the look he got when something had genuinely broken his prior assumptions. Vala arrived 30 seconds later and positioned herself against the wall with her arms crossed, watching the prisoners the way she watched anything that might be a threat, not with hostility, but with the patience of someone who had learned to read rooms faster than the room could read her. Daniel began. The language was not in the Asgard database. The database held thousands of languages from 2 galaxies and a handful of ascended being dialects, and this was none of them. But it was phonetically consistent and grammatically regular, which meant it was learnable, and he had spent his adult life learning things under worse conditions. He recorded everything the officers said. He played back standard greeting protocols until the youngest of them, the one who had been holding the mug, began responding to sound patterns. Rough contact. Barely a pigeon, but contact. She had been a Goa'uld host. She had spent years reading the expressions of people wearing forced masks, learning the difference between the arrogance a Goa'uld projected as a weapon, and the genuine fear it hid underneath. The Goa'uld were very good at performing power they did not always feel. These people were not performing. They were frightened in the specific, genuine way of soldiers who had just been shown a capability their commanders had not prepared them for, because their commanders had not known it existed. "Not false gods," she said quietly. "Just soldiers." O'Neill heard her. He filed it. 40 light minutes away and closing, in the command chamber of his flagship, the report arrived. Darth Vader read it standing. The summary was brief. One unidentified vessel, alien configuration, shields that had absorbed sustained turbolaser fire, beam weapons that had penetrated Imperial deflectors in under 4 seconds, personnel transported from a shielded bridge by a mechanism no reporting officer could classify. 3 crew missing, not aboard, location unknown. No precedent in any conquered or catalogued system. He stood in the filtered silence of his respirator and felt the dark side moving through the space around the ship, that old current reading the local force for threats he could identify before his instruments could. He found nothing. The alien vessel carried no force presence. Whatever intelligence crewed it, they were blind to the one thing that had decided the outcome of every significant conflict this galaxy had ever produced. An exceptionally capable ship operated by people who had no idea the force existed. He set course for the sector without addressing the officers waiting for his instructions. They understood. They always understood, eventually. Aboard the Odyssey, SG-1 assembled in the briefing room. Mitchell stood. TLC sat at the far end of the table, with his back straight, and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, which was how he looked when he was thinking hard, rather than resting. Carter had her sensor data. Daniel had his recorder, and the early fragments of a new language. O'Neill stood at the head of the table. "All right," he said. "This galaxy, what are we working with?" Carter answered, "First a military empire, established hierarchy, capital ships, planetary occupation, population control through force. Their shields are well designed for their threat environment. Our beams go through them. Their weapons penetrate our outer shielding but slowly. We have a substantial tactical edge." She paused. "There is no Stargate network, no Naquadar signatures, no gate home from this galaxy," Daniel said. "There's a resistance movement. I'm picking up signals on channels the Empire doesn't monitor. They know about the engagement with the Star Destroyer. They're interested." O'Neill nodded. He had been in this briefing room, in this conversation, in some version of it for 10 years. New galaxy, new uniforms on the people running things. Same structure beneath. One apex distributing fear down the chain. Enslaved populations calculating the odds on resistance. And somewhere in the Empire's foundation, a thing the apex believed about itself that was not true. There was always that thing. It was always the opening. We need allies, we need intelligence, and we need to find out what the people at the top of this empire think makes them untouchable. He set down the data file on the 3 officers in the cargo bay. Find the crack. He did not say what he was already thinking. Carter had flagged something unusual in the sensor data, a notation she had not explained to the room. The word she had used was intentional. 2 hours after the first contact, Daniel Jackson was having the most productive conversation of his life with someone he could barely understand. The signal had come in on a frequency the Imperial vessels in the sector were not monitoring, a gap in their scanning pattern that was either a deliberate blind spot or the kind of systematic oversight that large militaries produced when they stopped believing anyone. The source was a small ship running dark on the far side of a debris field, 2 crew, moving on minimal power. It had found the Odyssey before the Odyssey found it. Daniel had the recorder running and cold coffee to his right, and a language he was already calling New Galactic Standard Basic in his notes. It was structured, phonetically accessible, and built on enough regular grammar that he could build forward into it quickly, once he had the phonemic inventory. He recorded. He replayed. He tried sounds until the voice on the other end responded. He had gotten through identities and through intentions and arrived, laboriously, at the concept of a common enemy. The voice on the other end went cautious, and then it went warm. "They're rebels," he said to the bridge-com. "Fighting the Empire. They want to meet with the ship that broke a Star Destroyer's shields." O'Neill said, "Tell them we're not unfamiliar with empires." The meeting coordinates were a debris field 2 light hours from their current position. While Daniel continued developing the channel, Carter returned to the data problem that had been sitting at the edge of her attention since the previous night's sensor run. She pulled up the long-range biological scan overlay and studied it. The Asgard core ran biological mapping as a standard background function, cataloging life signs by mass, metabolic rate, and cellular density. What the core had been returning since the Odyssey dropped into this galaxy was a secondary reading beneath the biological layer, consistent and universe-wide, present in every organic reading at every distance. Not an electromagnetic phenomenon, something in the biology itself or adjacent to it that responded to the presence and movement of sentient life the way a magnetic field responded to current. Distributed, not uniform, but purposive in a way she was struggling to formalize. She had run it against Naquadar energy signatures, against the neurological interference profile of Goa'uld symbiotes, against the background readings she and Daniel had documented after his brief time among the Ascended. None of those matched this. The field predated the life signs moving through it and persisted after they moved on. It was not produced by biology. It was something biology moved within. He read it between transmissions and went still in the way he went, still when something connected to something he had not expected. Mitchell flew the approach to the debris field manual, which was his preference for anything involving proximity to rocks. The courier was smaller than a Teltac, and considerably older, its hull bearing 3 visible patch jobs in 2 different grades of plating. It moved well despite that. The adjustments during approach were precise and confident, the work of someone who had done this under conditions worse than a quiet sector debris field. These people had been surviving their war for a long time. The 2 ships docked without ceremony. Daniel and Vala went through the connecting tube on the Odyssey's side. Wind epochs. 2 rebel couriers in battered flight suits waited on the other, watching the newcomers with the particular wariness of people who had learned to keep their trust very close. The taller one had a hand near a sidearm. The shorter one kept their eyes on Daniel's recorder. Daniel introduced them, travelers from beyond the known galaxy. He did not mention the Star Destroyer engagement, because the taller courier's expression when the galaxy of origin came across in his rough pronunciation made it clear they already knew, and people who already know what you did do not need you to explain it. The conversation that followed was short and practical, and by the end of it, an address had been exchanged. Carter flagged O'Neill from the bridge. New contact. Incoming, fast and wrong. The vessel was Lambda, class, Imperial configuration, but moving on a trajectory that its drive signature did not account for. The Asgard Corps flagged the Delta as anomalous and ran a second scan, then a third. The shuttle was moving faster than its thrusters explained, and it was not making the compensation maneuvers that speed, at that vector, should require. The secondary energy field she had been tracking spiked at the shuttle's position, tightening around a single life sign aboard the craft, concentrating in a way she could measure but not source. The concentration was aimed at their position. "We need to leave," O'Neill said. "Over the docking tube comm." TLC was the last one through when the rebel courier's crew started shouting. On the corridor sensors, Carter watched the far hatch of the courier's docking bay open. No breach tool, no cutting torch. No one on the courier's side had touched it. The hatch simply opened. TLC turned before he reached the tube. The figure at the corridor's far end was armored in black and large in the way that only a suit built over something extensive could be. And it breathed with a mechanical rhythm that marked it as a thing maintained by machinery. TLEA had faced Goa'uld system lords. He had fought Apophis's elite guard and used best warriors and a prior of the Ori in a corridor not much wider than this one. He read combat presence the way a trained tracker read ground, and what he was reading was not a soldier. It was something categorically heavier. He leveled his staff weapon. The armored figure raised one hand. The force that closed around TLC's throat was invisible and without contact point. He had taken a ribbon device at close range, had felt the way it disrupted his nervous system at the cellular level. That was a machine working on biology. This was direct, no interface. The compression was precise and certain, and it was coming from a direction that had nothing to do with the raised hand in any mechanical sense he could construct. He did not fall. Jaffa physiology was not human physiology, and tretinin-sustained metabolism was not the ceiling of what a Jaffa could endure. 2 to 3 times baseline human strength. Pain tolerance that had been tested in the ring and outside it across decades of service. His throat was being compressed by something with no physical contact, and he took one step forward anyway, then another. His staff weapon was still raised. He did not fire, because firing would risk the docking tube, but he was standing and advancing, and that, apparently, was something the figure at the end of the corridor had not anticipated. The pressure increased. Teal stopped. Carter sealed the airlock from the Odyssey side. The docking tube retracted. Teals came, through 4 seconds later with one hand at his throat, and sat down on the deck. In the briefing room, Carter played back the corridor sensor recording for the team. The secondary energy field was visible in the data, in retrospect, as a slight coherent concentration that tracked the armored figure's gesture, not before it and not after it, in real time with the recording. Not a secondary emission from a handpiece or gauntlet from the figure directly. That wasn't technology, Daniel said. O'Neill looked at the sensor data for a long time. He had spent 10 years with the working assumption that any power sufficiently mysterious would, under examination, resolve into a device or a parasite or a performance. The Goa'uld had reinforced that assumption with 10 years of confirming evidence. The recording on Carter's screen was showing him something that did not fit any of those categories. It was not resolving. He said, "I know not denial. Acknowledgement. The map was wrong. Teal'c said from the deck, it was aware of me." O'Neill looked at him. "What do you mean? When I did not fall," Teal'c said, "it recalculated. I felt the adjustment." He paused. "Whatever it is not accustomed to being resisted." The room was quiet. On Carter's sensor display, the shuttle had reversed course and was moving away. The energy concentration had dispersed. But the field was still there across every biological reading in this galaxy, as her notation had said, intentional. The first crack in standard operating procedure was very small, but it was there. The rebel base was exactly what O'Neill would have built if he had been given 3 years, a failing supply chain, and a cause worth dying for. The installation occupied a network of natural caverns carved into a moon that did not appear on any current Imperial chart, or if it did, the entry was old enough that no patrol route had been assigned. The equipment was half salvaged and half improvised and arranged with the specific organization of people who had learned that losing something irreplaceable was worse than any single engagement. The personnel moved with purpose, not with the anxious efficiency of a force that had something to prove. These were people who had decided the decision had already cost them something, and they had paid it, and now they were doing the work. Daniel got by. His galactic basic was rough at the edges but functional where it needed to be, and the Alliance had at least 2 multilingual officers who had dealt with enough non-standard contact to extend patience to someone learning the language in real time. He introduced the team. He explained what he could. Vala was already making herself useful by the time the introductions ended, having identified the base's quartermaster by instinct and struck up a wordless negotiation using a universal medium, pointing at things and raising an eyebrow. The rebels listened in the manner of people who had already seen the sensor recording of what the Odyssey had done to a Star Destroyer's shields, and had decided that whatever questions they had were secondary to what that recording answered. The intelligence exchange happened in a chamber that served as both command center and map room. A senior rebel officer, a compact woman with the steady authority of someone who had planned too many operations to be moved by the drama of this one, laid out what she knew in plain terms, and Daniel translated as quickly as he could. The Empire's fleet was the enforcement mechanism. The Emperor was the foundation. And the Emperor, she said, was not a general. He was something else, something that had defeated every conventional strategy the Alliance had attempted, something that did not require a weapon to kill and had never been stopped by one aimed at it. Her description was careful and specific, the way someone describes a thing they have watched destroy people they respected. O'Neill said, through Daniel, "What's the power source?" The rebel officer paused. She looked at O'Neill for a long moment as if deciding something. Then she said, "It is not a power source. It is the Force." Daniel translated and then said nothing further. Back on the Odyssey, O'Neill assembled the team in the briefing room. Carter had her sensor overlays on the table. Mitchell stood with his arms crossed against the far wall. Teal E sat at the end of the table with the specific stillness he brought to rooms where something important was about to be established. "Classic Goa'uld play," O'Neill said. "The boss has a power nobody can stop. Everybody's afraid of it. Nobody's found the delivery mechanism." He looked at Carter. "Find the delivery mechanism," Carter said. "I've been looking. 12 hours since the corridor incident." She pulled up the sensor overlay from TLAC's encounter with the armored figure in the docking corridor. "There is no delivery mechanism, no hand device, no ribbon, no naquadah in any form. The energy field that moved with the gesture does not originate from a piece of technology. It originates from the person," Mitchell said. "So it's just him. It's something this galaxy calls the Force," Carter said. "I don't know what it is yet, but I can tell you what it isn't. It is not a Goa'uld device with good presentation. It's real." O'Neill looked at her. "Everything real has a source." "Yes," Carter said. "I'm working on it." Daniel had been quiet through this exchange, and with Daniel quiet usually meant he had gone somewhere in his own reasoning that he had not yet decided how to share. He waited until the others had left and said to O'Neill quietly, "Jack." A minute O'Neill waited. Daniel had his recorder, and the look he got when something had connected to something personal rather than academic. He said, "The ancients. When I ascended, when I was actually on that level of existence, whatever it was, there was no technology, no device, no interface between intention and effect. What I experienced was not a tool." He paused. It was a state, a quality of consciousness that acted on the physical world, because that is what consciousness is at that level. Mind and matter aren't separate things there. O'Neill said, "You saying what I think you're saying." "I'm saying our entire playbook rests on one assumption," Daniel said. "That every god's power is fake, that under every impressive demonstration is a device, a parasite, or a performance. What if the Force is real? What if the only thing that was fake was who was using it?" O'Neill stood with that. He did not answer. The philosophy debate with the rebel officers happened the following morning in the same map room, with better translation and less patience. One of the officers present was older, with the deliberate calm of someone trained in a practice that valued it and had the look of a person who had been in this argument before and had made a measured peace with the fact that it did not resolve quickly. He told O'Neill, through Daniel, to fight the Emperor, one needed to understand that the Force was not a weapon. It could not be wielded like one without consequences that compounded until the user became what they were fighting. Victory against the dark side of the Force did not come from a better weapon. It came from what a person carried. O'Neill said, "Where I come from, we don't need faith to defeat gods. We need the right weapon, the right moment, and someone willing to pull the trigger." The officer said, "Then you have never faced something that cannot be shot." O'Neill said, "You'd be surprised." They looked at each other across a distance wider than language. Neither moved. It was not a productive exchange by any formal measure. But it was honest, and in O'Neill's long experience, honest impasses were more useful than false agreements. You at least knew where you actually stood. Through all of it, Teal'c said almost nothing. He watched. He watched the rebel soldiers moving through the base, and what he saw in them was not what he had expected. He had served as first prime of Apophis for decades. He knew what conscripted service looked like, in the way people carried themselves, the specific tension of a body performing loyalty rather than choosing it. No one in this installation moved that way. They moved like people who had arrived at their position through a choice at personal cost and had decided the cost was correct. A young medic worked on a shoulder wound near the corridor entrance. The patient made no complaint. The medic worked without drama. Neither of them said anything that sounded like duty. They sounded like people doing something they had decided mattered. Teal recognized that. He had felt it himself on the day after Apophis fell, and the staff weapon was still in his hands, and he had to decide for the first time in his life what came next. The moment after, the false god was gone. What you were without the myth that had defined everything. These people lived in that moment. They had chosen to. He did not say any of this to the team. He filed it in the place where he kept things that were going to matter later, in ways that were not yet clear. Vader did not underestimate what he had seen. That was the first thing that separated him from every Imperial commander who had encountered the alien vessel and survived the encounter. The others had looked at the sensor data, searched for precedent in their tactical libraries, found none, and defaulted to the assumption that overwhelming force would solve what smaller force had failed to solve. Vader made no such assumption. He had faced too many things in this galaxy that broke the assumptions of less careful minds. The alien ship had penetrated Imperial deflectors with a beam weapon in under 4 seconds. It had transported personnel through an active shielded bridge by a mechanism his technical staff could not classify. Its crew registered as entirely invisible to the Force, which meant he could not read their intentions before they moved. 3 Star Destroyers, simultaneous tractor beams from 3 separate vectors. An object the alien ship's size could not escape 3 coordinated gravitational locks. The alien shields resisted turbolaser fire, but shields did not prevent the application of traction at sufficient magnitude. The Empire had never encountered a vessel that escaped 3 simultaneous tractor locks at close range. That fact had not changed because this vessel was unusual. The Odyssey's sensors read the formation coming in, and O'Neill understood the geometry before Carter finished her assessment. "They're going to pin us," he said. "They're going to try," Carter said. She had projections running on 2 screens simultaneously. The Asgard hyperdrive could pull them clear, but the spool time was 4 minutes, and the formation was closing faster than that. 2 of the 3 tractor beams were going to achieve lock before the drive was ready. 2 locks at this scale from opposing vectors were enough to halt a ship the Odyssey's size completely. The force balance would be net 0, and they would not be going anywhere. The first lock hit. The vibration moved through the hull from aft to bow, a deep shudder unlike a weapon impact, more like the ship was being squeezed from both sides by something patient and very large. Mitchell, at the helm, fought the attitude controls on instinct and found nothing to fight against. The Odyssey wasn't being hit, it was being held. The second lock hit 41 seconds later from the port dorsal vector. The shudder intensified and then settled into a low, constant resonance. The Odyssey stopped. "They knew," Carter said. "Our shields handle energy weapons. They don't handle momentum. 2 opposing fields at this magnitude, and the net force balance keeps us stationary. We are not going anywhere without taking one of them off the board." "Options," O'Neill said. "1," Carter said. A pause. "I was afraid of that," O'Neill said. She had been building the targeting solution since the first lock landed. The Asgard transporter could lock on any mass and electromagnetic signature it could resolve in its scan envelope. The reactor core of an Imperial Star Destroyer was the largest discrete power source inside the ship's hull, and its electromagnetic output was distinctive, consistent, and readable from the outside or the inside with equal precision. The transporter did not interact with a ship's hull to operate. It did not interact with a ship's deflector shields either, because the transporter did not move in a domain that hulls and shields addressed. Imperial engineers had built an excellent deflector shield. They had built it against every weapon this galaxy produced. They had not built it against a technology this galaxy had never seen. Carter allocated one Naquadah-enhanced warhead to the transporter. A Naquadah-enhanced nuclear warhead detonated inside a sealed reactor housing at the center of a 1.6-kilometer capital ship produced a result that was not partial. The transporter locked. The warhead was no longer in the Odyssey's munitions bay. The second Star Destroyer's running lights went out, all of them at once, which was not what happened when a weapon struck the exterior of a ship. It was very much what happened when the detonation point was internal. The hull held for just over a second, then it did not. The failure began at the reactor section and propagated forward and aft simultaneously. Secondary explosions cascading through power conduits and fuel lines in a chain that covered the full length of the vessel in under 3 seconds. When it was over, an expanding field of superheated debris occupied the space where a capital ship of the Galactic Empire had been, and the tractor beam that had held the Odyssey's starboard quarter was no longer functioning. One lock remained. Carter fired 2 Asgard plasma pulses at the third Star Destroyer's tractor array housing. The second lock died. The Odyssey moved. The third Star Destroyer did not advance to fill the gap. O'Neill watched it on the tactical display, watching the captain do the calculation that every Imperial officer left in this sector was now running. One ship destroyed from the inside with no external impact signature, one tractor array disabled in 2 shots. The third Star Destroyer was not outmatched in the conventional sense. It was outclassed by something it had no category for and no defense against. And that distinction was the most paralyzing one in any engagement. It broke off and retreated past the edge of transporter range as if the range of the alien weapon was known it was not, and that distance was safe. It was not certain that it was. Imperial communications traffic spiked across the sector band. "Now they're afraid of something they don't understand," O'Neill said. "Good." Carter delivered the accounting in the briefing room 1 hour later, in the measured tone she used for numbers that did not improve with inflection. Shields, 42%. Warheads remaining, 8. Hyperdrive, operational. But the destination problem had not changed. No coordinates home. The Asgard computer core had been running correlating analysis on the anomaly since arrival, and Carter's current best hypothesis placed a resolution timeline between 3 weeks and 4 months, depending on which of 2 candidate models proved correct. Mitchell said, "So we're stuck." Carter said, "We're stuck." O'Neill sat at the head of the table and looked at the summary for a moment. Then, quietly, "How many people fight the Empire across this galaxy?" Carter said, "The organized rebel alliance counts in the tens of thousands. Beyond that, civilian populations under Imperial occupation across hundreds of systems, substantially more." O'Neill did not say anything else. He did not need to. The table understood what the silence contained, because they had all been in some version of this conversation before, in various briefing rooms and various galaxies, with various structures of authoritarian control sitting on top of various populations who had not chosen the arrangement. The warhead count and the shield percentage were real constraints. They were not the only numbers on the table. Vader's report was brief and precise. He stood before the holographic transmitter in his personal quarters aboard the flagship and delivered the summary without embellishment. The alien vessel could not be stopped by conventional Imperial weapons or standard tactical approaches. It carried a transport technology of unknown mechanism capable of placing a warhead inside a shielded ship with no external delivery vector. Its crew demonstrated no force sensitivity whatsoever. And yet they had neutralized a 3-ship coordinated tactical formation in under 6 minutes by methods the Empire had no framework to anticipate. From the other end of the transmission, there was a pause. The kind of pause that came from a mind working at its own pace, unhurried, because it had learned long ago that patience was a more reliable instrument than urgency. Do not destroy them. His voice was soft in the way that things were soft when they did not need to be loud. I wish to see what they are. Vader closed the transmission. He did not add to the Emperor's assessment. The instruction was clear, and the reasoning behind it required no elaboration. A crew of beings who were blind to the Force and who operated with the tactical intelligence of something that had fought gods. The Emperor wanted to see what that looked like up close. In the debris field behind Vader's flagship, the expanding cloud of what had been a Star Destroyer continued moving outward in every direction at the same constant speed. The record of something unprecedented written in cooling metal, spreading through the dark. Daniel's case to O'Neill took 4 minutes and 11 seconds, which O'Neill timed with his eyes on the ceiling, in the way he listened to briefings that were going to end with him saying yes anyway. The rebel intelligence channels had identified a target Daniel argued was more valuable than anything else they could access in this galaxy. An old being, small, the last surviving master of the Jedi tradition, in exile on a remote world with no current Imperial presence and no record in active Imperial databases. Daniel's argument was straightforward. If the Force was real, not a device, and not a performance, and the sensor evidence from the corridor encounter indicated it was, they needed to talk to someone who had spent 900 years living inside it. 900, O'Neill said. Approximately. O'Neill looked at the star chart Daniel had placed on the briefing table. A remote system, well outside the main Imperial patrol corridors. He studied it for a moment. Mitchell flies, he said. You're back in 48 hours. The planet came up on the Odyssey's sensors as a dense, swampy world with an atmosphere thick enough to scatter long-range scans and a biosignature reading the Asgard core, flagged as unusual. Not dangerous. Unusual in the specific way of the secondary energy field Carter had been mapping across the galaxy since their arrival. The Force Overlay, as the team had started calling it in shorthand, registered here at a magnitude several times greater than any other location they had sampled. It came off the planet's surface like heat off stone in summer, and unlike everything else in space, it was not attenuating with distance. It was constant and dense and pointed nowhere in particular. Mitchell landed the shuttle in a clearing the sensors identified as the flattest available ground, which was not flat. He said to Daniel, "Call if anything tries to eat you." The fog was immediate on both sides. The air smelled of water and old growth, and something underneath both that had no equivalent in 2 galaxies of reference. Daniel walked with his recorder active and the translator program running on the audio feed, cataloging ambient sound. He had been in stranger environments. He had briefly been in no environment at all. This was at least a place with ground. He heard movement in the undergrowth to his left and stopped. A small figure stood at the fog's edge. Green-skinned, very old in a way that the face and the posture and the quality of stillness all confirmed at once, watching Daniel with large eyes that had accumulated enough years to be past easy surprise and had arrived somewhere on the far side of it that looked unexpectedly like curiosity. "Felt you enter orbit, I did," Yoda said. His voice was unhurried in the way of something that had stopped measuring time against urgency. "Strong in the Force, you are not?" A pause, the kind that held a thought rather than releasing it. "And yet," Daniel said in his best galactic basic, "I'm not. I don't think." Yoda tilted his head. "Somewhere you have been," he said, "that the Force does not reach, and from it you returned." The ancient eyes examined Daniel, the way a scholar examines a text that contradicts something held as settled and is not entirely displeased by the complication. A trace it leaves faint. Daniel had thought about how to explain ascension for 3 days. He said, "There is a level of existence above the physical, a higher plane, where beings who were once like us go when they give up physical form. I was there briefly. I came back. I don't carry anything from it, but I have been there, and I know what it felt like." Yoda considered this for a long moment in the fog and the sound of old trees. "Know this thing, I do," he said finally. "Different it is in this galaxy. The same it is in what it means." At the clearing's edge where the fog was thickest, a light appeared that was not from any identifiable source. It assembled itself into a shape, a figure standing in the undergrowth, luminous and present, made of something that was not quite light, and not quite solid, but was entirely there. He had briefly inhabited something like it. He had also once sat in a room with Omedasala and understood that the boundary between the living and the dead was a property of physics, not of will. Obi-Wan Kenobi looked at Daniel for a long time, then to Yoda. "He has seen the other side," Yoda said, "returned from it." "He has," Obi-Wan considered that, and nodded once and dispersed back into the light at the fog's edge. Daniel watched the clearing where the figure had been and was not disturbed by it, because he had sat with the dead before and had briefly been among them. He turned back to Yoda. "I came to ask about the Force," he said. "I know," Yoda said. The teaching was not what Daniel had expected. He had expected something closer to doctrine, and Yoda offered something closer to description. The Force was not a god. It was not worshipped, not by the Jedi. It did not make demands or hear prayers or grant advantage in exchange for devotion. It was not owned by anyone. It simply was present through every living thing in the galaxy, and those with the sensitivity to perceive it could choose to move with it or move against it. Moving against it carried a cost that accumulated slowly, and then all at once. Daniel said, "In my galaxy there are beings, ancients we call them, who have given up physical form and exist on a higher plane. They are not worshipped either. They simply are at a different level. They do not require anything from us." He paused. "Is that similar?" Yoda said. "Touched the light. You have not of this galaxy's light, but light it was." He looked at Daniel steadily. "In all that light, someone in charge of it was there. Not a question, an observation." Daniel said, "No. No one is in charge of it," Yoda said. "No." Daniel went quiet. After a time, the old master asked, "Your people, what do they fight for?" Daniel compressed a decade into the clearest galactic basic he had. He said, "We believe no one should have to kneel. Not to a person, not to a god, regardless of how much power that person holds. Power does not grant ownership of other lives." Yoda was quiet for a moment that extended past comfortable. "Fear of false gods," he said, "your enemy was. Yes, he settled his weight on the root where he sat. The Force is not a false god, yet the one who wields the dark side." He paused. "He is." Daniel held that. The dark side was not the Force. Sidious was not the Force. Sidious was a person who had found the Force and made a choice about it, the choice to use it as a weapon and a claim to ownership over other lives. And having made that choice, he had called it strength. Because if you named your wound strength, you could stop examining it. The lie was not the Force. The lie was the insistence that darkness was the only honest response to the universe, and that anyone who believed otherwise was naive. That was a lie, SG. Daniel said goodbye to Yoda and walked back through the fog. He did not speak on the return flight. He was finishing a sentence he had started 3 days ago in the Rebel base map room. Back on the Odyssey, he gathered the team in the briefing room and did not lead with reasoning. He stated the conclusion. "We have not been fighting gods for 10 years, he said. We have been fighting people who pretended to be gods. That distinction matters here, because the Emperor is not pretending. His power is real, but it is not what he claims it is. He calls it strength. The last Jedi Master alive calls it sickness. Our job is not to prove the Force is fake. Our job is to find what it costs him to use it the way he uses it, and what he cannot do without paying that cost." O'Neill looked at him for a moment. "That," he said, "we know how to do." Vader had built a profile of each of them. He had done it after the first corridor encounter and refined it from the Imperial data captured during the initial engagement, assembling what the Force and the sensor recordings together told him about each member of the alien crew. The woman with the scientific mind who had designed the weapons and the transport countermeasures. The linguist who had somehow passed through a plane of existence that should have been unreachable and returned from it. A fact the Force registered in his signature the way scar tissue registered in the body. The pilot. The con artist who watched every room with the patience of someone who expected to have to leave it quickly. And the Jaffa. Vader was most interested in the Jaffa. A being who had served a false master for decades, carrying the burden of that service as a point of honor, and who had then turned against the master not out of opportunity but out of principle. The Force did not show Vader Force sensitivity in the Jaffa, there was none. But the Force showed him other things. The emotional architecture of a person, old grief, buried so deep under discipline that it had become structural. Anger that had found a permanent address somewhere below the surface and was not leaving. The kind of anger that came from having been used, and from having believed in the thing that was using you, and from having had to dismantle that belief one piece at a time. Vader recognized it. The Empire tracked the F-302's exhaust signature through what the rebel pilots had believed was a clean corridor. 2 Star Destroyers dropped out of hyperspace over the installation. The Odyssey scrambled. Mitchell was in his fighter before the alert fully sounded, and the F-302 hit the engagement envelope with 4 other craft from the Odyssey's complement behind him, buying time against a fighter screen that outnumbered them at better than 8-1. He flew the way he always flew, when the math was wrong, faster than the math, and dirtier, and with the specific aggression of a pilot who had decided that if the numbers said he was going to lose, then the numbers had not yet met him. The rebels evacuated. Vader's shuttle did not go to the Odyssey. He had assessed the alien ship's transport technology. It could move personnel through solid matter and active shielding, which meant the Odyssey was not a target he could board by conventional means. He went to the surface installation instead, where the alien crew would be. He wanted them intact. The Emperor had been explicit. The base was already mostly clear when Vader moved through it. Rebel soldiers fell back in his wake, the ones who were still present, making the correct calculation that fighting him personally was not a winnable engagement. He let them run. He was looking for a specific biosignature, and the Force told him where it was before his sensors did. a corridor, half collapsed from a turbolaser strike that had made it through the installation's upper shielding. TLES stood at the far end with his staff weapon leveled, and he did not move. Vader stopped. He did not attack. He read the Jaffa in the Force, the architecture of the buried thing he had identified in the profile, and he said, "You know what it is to carry a symbol of false power and call it duty. You did it for years." He let that land. "I sensed the weight of it from the first moment I saw you." Teal'c said nothing. The staff weapon remained leveled. His face was the face of a man who had heard words he had thought about for a long time and was not going to let their accuracy move him. Vader said, "Are you free, or have you merely traded one master for another? You serve these humans now as you served your god. What is the difference?" TLS fired. The plasma bolt came across the corridor, and Vader's blade was already moving, the deflection clean and precise. Teal'c had already closed the distance. The staff weapon came around in a horizontal strike that would have broken a baseline human's collarbone, and Vader caught it with one hand, stopping the motion completely, and pushed. Not with his hands, with the Force. The push moved TLC through the corridor wall on the left side, through the material of it, into the adjacent space, and the debris followed him inward in a cascade of dust and partition material. There was a moment of complete silence. TLC rose from the debris. He rose slowly, and he did not use the wall for support. And he came back through the hole he had made into the corridor, with his staff weapon still in his hand. His left shoulder was damaged. He was bleeding from the scalp. He leveled the weapon again. Vader looked at him. Jaffa physiology, 2 to 3 times human strength, a pain threshold built over decades in Apophyse's fighting pits, an endurance ceiling that Tretonin-sustained metabolism pushed past what the push had apparently expected to finish. The Jaffa had been thrown through a wall and had gotten back up, and was standing here in a collapsed corridor, pointing a weapon at a Sith Lord, and his expression was not defiance. It was the look of a person who had made up their mind about a very long time ago. "I serve no master," Teal'c said. He said it clearly. He said it like a true thing. And yet, he said it the way a person says a thing that is true, and that they are still in some small and private place, working out. The way a person says something they have said before, and believe, and will keep believing, and still, sometimes in the dark, return to check. Vader heard the difference. The Force made it audible. He reached out with the Force to close the distance. The Asgard transporter hit before the grip fully engaged. Teal'c disappeared. Not a beam, not a visible effect. The space where the Jaffa had been standing was simply empty, instantaneously, between one moment and the next. Vader stood in the corridor and looked at the absence. He had felt the transporter happen in the Force. A displacement, a removal, a thing moved from here to somewhere else by a method that the Force perceived, but could not trace. He did not pursue. The alien ship's transport range exceeded the distance to his shuttle, and he had no mechanism to intercept it. He stood in the corridor alone and considered what he had confirmed. The question would keep working. That was the thing about a question aimed correctly at a buried wound. It did not need a follow-up. It lodged itself in the architecture of the doubt that was already there, and simply waited. He had given the Jaffa something to carry back to the alien ship, something that would be there in the meditation practice, and in the quiet moments, and in every conversation where the Jaffa told the others he was fine. He returned to his shuttle. On the Odyssey, TLC did not report to the medical bay first. He went to the cargo bay. He sat down in the dark on a supply container near the aft bulkhead, and he was still in the way that he was still, when he was not resting, but thinking, back straight, hands on his knees. The meditation practice he had maintained since his days as a First Prime was not a religious observance. It was a discipline of attention. He had used it for years to separate what was true from what was convenient, what he believed from what he had been told to believe. He used it now. He had told Vader, "I serve no master." It was true. He had chosen this. The free Jaffa nation, the alliance with the Tauri, the mission. He had chosen all of it with full awareness of what he was choosing and why, and he did not regret any of it. And yet the question was still in the room with him, in the dark, in the cargo bay, at the aft bulkhead of an alien ship on the far side of the universe. Because the thing about Vader's question was not that it was right. The thing about the question was that TLC did not yet have an answer that fit perfectly and did not leave any remainder. He sat in the dark, and he waited for the answer to come, the way it always came, slowly and by itself, and only when he stopped trying to construct it. The lights in the cargo bay did not come on. Carter presented her findings the morning after the engagement with the flat economy of someone reporting the results of an experiment they had hoped would go differently. She had identified midi-chlorians, microscopic biological components present in every living thing in this galaxy, but present at substantially higher concentrations in beings the Force moved through more readily. She had confirmed their existence across 3 independent sample sets, and she was certain about the correlation. They were, she said, the interface. The point of contact between living biology and the field she had been tracking since arrival. Not the Force itself. She was explicit on that distinction, because the distinction mattered for what came next. What came next was the limit. The Force responds to internal state, she said, not to midichlorian density alone. 2 beings with identical biological concentrations can interact with the Force in categorically different ways depending on what they carry inside them. Fear, anger, grief, calm intent. The field responds to that, to the quality of the person. She set down her datapad. I cannot build a counter. I cannot engineer calm or selflessness into a mechanism. I cannot build a device that makes Vader afraid of it. The Force is not a technology problem. What kind of problem is it? O'Neill said. A person problem, Carter said. The room sat with that. She moved to her second report, which was the one she had been less eager to deliver. During the last 2 engagements, Imperial sensors had been running extended passive scans on the Odyssey shields under sustained fire. The Empire did not understand Asgard shielding mechanics. The engineering principles were simply not present in this galaxy, and would take years of study to reverse engineer from first principles. But what Imperial sensors did not need to understand was that the Asgard shields operated at a specific and consistent energy frequency. They had that frequency now, twice confirmed. A future attack optimized for that frequency will cut through our shielding significantly faster, Carter said. The effective hit tolerance goes from 14 impacts to somewhere between 4 and 6, depending on how precisely they can tune the weapon systems to the resonance. They're adapting, she paused. They're not replicators. They can't absorb a technology and deploy a counter in seconds. But they are good engineers with very large fleets and time they are willing to spend on this problem. O'Neill said, How long? Weeks, Carter said. Maybe days if their science divisions are as capable as their shipbuilding suggests. The boarding action came that same afternoon. An Imperial assault shuttle approached on a vector hidden behind a sensor-scrambling decoy, not a jamming system, but a piece of misdirection, a passive emitter that made its own signature read as background debris at the distance the Odyssey's active sensors were calibrated for. the shuttle was inside minimum safe departure distance before the core flagged the anomaly and corrected. It docked at the secondary airlock on the port quarter with the practiced speed of a crew that had done this before. 40 stormtroopers came through the breach. They came organized in staggered 2x2 formation, moving with the disciplined efficiency of baseline military, whose training had been compressed and standardized and enforced. No force powers, no enhanced physiology. Armor and blasters and numbers and the kind of coordination that came from doing the same thing many times. The boarding alarm sounded across the Odyssey, and SG-1 moved into their ship because SG-1 knew the Odyssey in the dark. Teal'c took the main corridor. He positioned himself at the junction where the port airlock passage met the central axis of the ship, and he held it. A staff weapon in his right hand and a P-90 in his left, which was not regulation and which produced an accurate description of the corridor after the first exchange of fire. Stormtroopers advanced in pairs, and each pair encountered a Jaffa warrior with decades of combat experience, Jaffa physiology, and a complete absence of the instinct to take cover when cover was unavailable. He was not a Jedi. He had no force awareness. What he had was a 2 to 3 times human basiline body that did not process the same pain signals at the same threshold, positioned in a 3-meter corridor where numbers could only arrive in the arrangement the corridor permitted. In the lateral passage off the port junction, Vala locked the intercom to a specific frequency she had been quietly memorizing since they arrived, and she spoke into it in Galactic Basic that was better than it had any business being. She identified herself as a crew officer. She generated an emergency tone in the background using the Odyssey's own alert systems, and she reported a secondary breach in Storage Bay 7 with a calm authority that the Stormtrooper squad leaders in the adjacent passage believed completely. 3 squads redirected themselves into Storage Bay 7, and the bay sealed from the outside because Vala was already at the control panel with the bay locked before the last soldier crossed the threshold. She looked at the sealed door for a moment. "Still got it," she said to no one in particular. Mitchell held the aft section with 2 of the Odyssey's support crew, not through any comparable firepower, but by using the ventilation system and the maintenance accessway network to redirect stormtroopers through sections of the ship that went nowhere and from which exiting required passing back through the same choke points they had already encountered. O'Neill and Daniel held the bridge behind a bulkhead lock. Carter did not stop working on the sensor console for the entire engagement. 21 minutes after the breach, Carter triggered a proximity alarm on the ship's external sensor array. Not a real alert. An internally generated alarm formatted identically to the Odyssey's genuine reactor proximity warning, routed through the external broadcast on the frequency the Empire had been monitoring since their first contact. The alarm stated, in terms their sensor interpretation software could pass, that the Odyssey's reactor containment was approaching a critical threshold that would make the current docking configuration hazardous. The stormtroopers withdrew. Not quickly, and not in disorder. They pulled back in the same organized progression they had used to advance, which was its own kind of information. O'Neill watched the assault shuttle detach and accelerate away from the port quarter and did not feel the particular relief of a problem solved. He felt the kind of wariness that came from watching an enemy do something correctly. Their sensors were running the whole time they were aboard, Carter said. Shield frequency confirmed, and they mapped the interior layout of the decks they reached. Learning, O'Neill said. Learning, Carter said. Ship's night was an arbitrary designation on a vessel with no planetary cycle to anchor to, but it served a function. It was the time when the corridor lighting dimmed and most of the crew slept, and the briefing room was empty enough that 2 people could sit in it. O'Neill sat with Daniel. He said, "Walk me through what you said after Dagobah again. Not the philosophy, the operational part," Daniel said. "Find what it costs him to keep the dark side." Right. O'Neill sat back. He had been turning this over for 2 days in the spaces between engagements. Every god we've encountered had a weakness. Ra bled when we shot him, literally bled, because underneath the technology he was a parasite in a borrowed body. The Ori needed worship. The entire source of their power was the faith of their believers, and when the Ark of Truth removed that faith, the power went with it. Anubis couldn't be killed by conventional means, so Omedasala contained him instead of destroying him. He looked at Daniel. "What does the Emperor's power need?" Daniel said. "It needs him to keep choosing it. The dark side isn't a switch. It's a sustained commitment. Every time he acts from fear instead of strength, from hatred instead of purpose, he reaffirms the choice. The moment he stops choosing it, it loses its hold." O'Neill said, "So the question is, what would make him stop choosing it?" "Yes, and whether we can ask that question to his face," O'Neill said, "before he does something irreversible to this galaxy." The room was quiet. Outside the briefing room windows, the stars of an unfamiliar galaxy held their positions, as they had since the first morning, offering nothing and requiring nothing and remaining absolutely indifferent to the question of whether it was answerable. Darth Sidious did not learn about the alien ship from a report. He learned about it the way he learned most things that mattered, through the Force. Not a specific intelligence, not as a sensor reading converted to words, but as a quality in the fabric of the Force itself, a persistent ripple in something that should have been smooth. A technology from outside this galaxy, operated by beings with no Force presence at all, who nonetheless moved through the Force's fabric without being shaped by it. They were not strong in the Force. They were not weak in the Force. They were simply outside it entirely, and the Force noticed their absence, the way, still, water notices a stone. Sidious had spent a millennium developing his understanding of the Force and centuries in political calculation and intelligence work of every kind. He had encountered almost nothing in that time that was genuinely new, not as a category, not as a thing that required him to build a new framework rather than apply an existing one. They moved through the galaxy as if its fundamental laws were properties they were studying rather than rules they were bound by. And they had done something in their own galaxy that the Sith, in all their history, had failed to do. They had killed gods, not by becoming stronger than those gods, by asking better questions. He turned this over without urgency, the way he turned everything. What interested him was not the technology, though the technology was remarkable. What interested him was the crew. Beings who had fought entities wielding power analogous to the Force and had won, not by becoming stronger, not by developing Force sensitivity, but by finding the seam in the argument, a powerful entity made about itself and pulling until the structure came apart. Sidious had that skill. He had simply never expected to find it in beings who did not know the Force existed. Sidious was interested. Interest from Darth Sidious was the most dangerous thing in this galaxy. The previous order had been standard: assess the threat, contain if possible, destroy if necessary. The new order was not standard. Do not destroy the vessel, do not harm the crew, capture them. Especially the one who had touched a plane of existence beyond this galaxy's Force, whose signature registered strangely, carrying the trace of somewhere the Force did not reach. And especially the one carrying old grief behind his discipline, the former servant of a false master who had turned against it. Vader understood his master's intent without needing it explained. Sidious wanted to know whether beings from outside this galaxy's force could be offered to the dark side. And more than that, he wanted to understand what they knew. A crew who had killed gods without the force was something he had no entry for in his experience. He wanted one. Vader acknowledged the new directive and set course. A rebel intelligence courier reached the Odyssey 3 days after the boarding action. The operative had the look of someone who had been moving fast through Imperial space and was not yet ready to stop. Through Daniel, the message was clear and brief. The Emperor had taken a direct personal interest in the alien ship and its crew. The boarding action had not been a serious capture attempt. It had been a demonstration. We can get to you. We can find you anywhere you shelter. The next communication would not be a boarding. An intermediary, representing the Emperor's personal authority, would be present at a specified location to offer terms. O'Neill listened to Daniel's translation and was quiet for a moment. He wants to meet, he said. The team debate happened in the briefing room with everyone at the table, and nobody particularly happy. Tauta went first. Going to a meeting offered by the Emperor was walking into a trap. The location would be controlled. The security positioning would be established in advance. Whatever was offered would be designed to produce a specific outcome, because everything Darth Sidious offered was designed to produce a specific outcome. She said all of this in the even tone of someone making a technical assessment rather than a personal objection. Daniel said every meeting with a gold was also a trap. They had attended most of them. Vala said, "We've attended worse dinners." Mitchell said, "What's the play?" O'Neill looked around the table. He had been thinking about this since the night conversation with Daniel, since the question had finished itself out loud. What would make the Emperor stop choosing the dark side, and whether they could ask it to his face? He said, "We are not going to accept the terms. We are not going to decline the terms. We are going to ask a question. One question to the most powerful person in this galaxy, in a room where he is listening. If the question lands right, the crack it opens does more work than 8 warheads. If it doesn't land, we beam out, and we fight the rest of this differently." Mitchell said, "You want to talk to the most powerful force user in the galaxy, and you're hoping to win by asking him something." "Has worked before," O'Neill said. He was thinking of Ra, who had bled when shot because underneath the golden mask and the theatrical staging and the millennia of accumulated myth was a parasite in a borrowed human body, and the whole empire built on that parasite's divinity had not survived the moment one person refused to accept that the theater was the reality. He was thinking of Apophis, whose Jaffa armies had scattered not because SG-1 had outgunned him. They had never outgunned him, but because they had spent years pulling apart the architecture of loyalty and fear that held an empire together until the walls came down on their own. He was thinking of the Ori, whose empire had ended the moment the Ark of Truth cut the faith that powered it and left the beings behind the faith with nothing in every case. The weapon was not the point. The question was the point. "Fair enough," Daniel said quietly. Teal had been at the end of the table throughout this exchange, in the stillness he used when he was thinking rather than observing. He said, "I will go with you." O'Neill started to frame a reason why that was a higher risk choice for Teal'c, specifically given what Vader had already demonstrated about his ability to read the Jaffa's emotional architecture through the Force. Teal said, "Vader asked me whether I serve a master or a principal. I did not answer cleanly. I would like to answer it in person." The room was quiet, in the specific way it went quiet when everyone understood something and nobody needed to say what it was. Teal'c had been carrying Vader's question for days. He was going to answer it, and he was going to answer it somewhere. It would count. O'Neill said, "Fair enough." The Odyssey dropped out of hyperspace into a debris field. 43 light minutes from the nearest inhabited system. Kilometers of wreckage from some conflict neither side of this meeting knew the history of, drifting in slow clusters, old enough that the superheated edges had long since cooled. Carter had chosen the field specifically. Radar scattering, sensor cluttered, and large enough to make a clean targeting solution on the Odyssey itself take time that a transporter jump could exploit. A Lambda-class shuttle emerged from the clutter on an approach vector. Then, at extreme range, 2 Star Destroyers moved into position. Not attack posture. Neither vessel had weapons at bear. Reminder posture. We are here. We know where you are. The engagement at your discretion is an engagement at ours. Carter noted the range on her console and ran the calculation and said very quietly, "We could beam a warhead into either of those from here." She said it once. She did not say it again. Everyone at the tactical station heard her. No one raised a weapon. The Lambda-class shuttle continued its approach through the debris field at a careful speed, neither hurrying nor stopping, the way something moved when it knew its destination and was not afraid of what it would find there. O'Neill watched it come and thought about every room he had ever walked into, knowing it was a trap past a certain point. A trap was just a room with a hostile person in it. He was good at rooms with hostile people. The question was whether the hostile person in this one was the kind that a question could reach. He was going to find out. He straightened his jacket. "Carter," he said. "Keep the hyperdrive warm already is," she said. The shuttle docked. The station had been abandoned long enough that the emergency lighting had failed in 2 of the 3 chambers, the hull emitting the low ticks of metal cooling in the dark, and the dust on the floor held no footprints, which told O'Neill that Vader had not entered through any door the station possessed. O'Neill and Teal materialized in the center chamber, standing upright, exactly where Carter had targeted them, which placed them 3 meters from the room's only other occupant. Vader stood with his back to the main entrance arch. The Force-sensitive O'Neill had come to understand did not read space from exits and entrances. They read it from wherever the attention was pointed. In the far corner, a holographic emitter on a portable tripod cast pale blue light in a cone. Within the cone, a figure sat in a high-backed chair, visible only at its edges, the face above the chair lost in shadow under a dark hood. The hands below the hood rested on the chair's arms completely still. The eyes beneath the hood caught the chamber's ambient light and returned none of it. Sidious did not speak. He watched. Vader said, "You are unarmed." "Notice that," O'Neill said. "It is not a conventional strategy. Depends on what we're here to accomplish." O'Neill looked at Vader with the directness he brought to every negotiation he had ever entered, which was the directness of a man who had decided some time ago that presenting as anything other than exactly what he was in these rooms was a waste of everyone's time. "We're here to listen. Make the offer." Vader made it. He delivered it precisely, without ornamentation. The Emperor offered SG-1 a position within the Imperial structure. Their technology, their tactical knowledge, their understanding of what existed beyond this galaxy's reach in service of the Emperor's order. In exchange, the full resources of the Galactic Empire would be directed toward identifying the mechanism that had brought them here, replicating it, and providing a confirmed path home. The offer was specific, reasoned, and without stated coercion. It was complete. O'Neill let it finish. He looked at Vader for a moment, not at the hologram. He said, "We've had this offer before." Vader said, "I know, no," O'Neill said. "Not like this. Not from beings that were actually as powerful as your Emperor. We call them the Ori. They were real. I want to be clear about that, because we've run into a lot of things that weren't, and they were. Genuine power, on a scale your emperor would recognize. They crossed to our galaxy from another one, and they reshaped planets and killed stars, and the weapons we had at the time could not touch them. And they offered the same terms to our entire galaxy. Serve us, and we will protect you and give you what you want. He paused. We declined, Vader said, and they're gone. A moment in which neither the armored figure nor the hologram moved. The mechanism of their defeat, Vader said, was a question, O'Neill said. That led to another question and eventually to the answer. Then the whole structure came down. The Ori needed worship the way your Emperor's dark side needs anger. When we cut the worship, the power source went with it. That's what we do. We find the power source, and we cut it. We've done it more than once. Sidious had not spoken. His hands had not moved on the arms of the chair. O'Neill continued. Your Emperor's power is real, he said. I believe that. I've stood in front of things that weren't, and I know the difference. The Goa'uld dressed themselves in the symbols of gods, and they were parasites in borrowed bodies. The Ori called themselves divine, and they ran on the faith of the people they had convinced to worship them. Impressive, both of them. Neither one was actually what they claimed. He kept his voice even, the voice he used in briefing rooms where something important was being decided, and raising it would be a waste of good conviction. Your Emperor is not a fraud. I'm not going to insult either of us by calling him one. He is something else, a man who found real power and chose how to use it, and then told everyone around him that the choice he made was the only choice available, that the hierarchy he built was natural and fixed, and everyone in their position should be grateful to be there. We have heard that argument. We have fought entire civilizations built on that argument. He let that land. We won. Not because we were stronger. We were almost never stronger. And we weren't stronger here either. We won because we refused the premise. We do not kneel, we do not serve, we do not join. We find the flaw in the argument, and we pull on it, and everything that has ever called itself a god has had a flaw in its argument. Every single one. In 10 years across 2 galaxies, we have not yet found the exception. He looked directly at the dark lenses. We are not going to find it here. The chamber was very quiet. There's a question I've been building toward since we arrived in this galaxy, O'Neill said. He kept his hands at his sides. No weapon. No gesture toward threat. It's not a challenge. It's not a taunt. It is a genuine question. And I want to ask it, and then we're gonna leave. And whatever you do with it after that is your business. The Ori drew their power from worship, O'Neill said. The faith of believers was their literal power source. When my team found that out, we built something called the Ark of Truth, and we cut the faith. The moment the believers stopped believing, the Ori had nothing. Gone. He looked from Vader to the still figure in the hologram and back. Your Emperor's power comes from the dark side. I have been talking to people in this galaxy who have studied the dark side their entire lives. They tell me it runs on anger, on hatred, on grief, on the will to dominate, that it feeds on those things, that it amplifies them and needs them to keep running. He paused. So here is my question. What happens to the dark side when the man using it stops being angry? What happens to your Emperor when he runs out of things to hate? The question sat in the room. It was not a large question in terms of words. It occupied approximately 4 seconds of speech. But O'Neill had spent enough time in rooms with powerful people to know that some questions were small in form and very large in implication, and the large in implication ones were the ones that showed up in the face before the person had decided what to do about them. Sidious did not answer. His hands on the chair arms did not move, but something in the quality of the stillness had changed, and O'Neill, who had been reading rooms for 20 years, felt the change even if he could not name its mechanism. The patience that had been in the room since the emitter started had a different texture now. It was not the patience of a mind waiting for its moment. It was the patience of a mind that had just been handed something it had not expected to have to handle. Vader was very still. The silence extended past the point where a response would normally have come. Teal stepped forward. He addressed Vader, not the hologram. He said, "I served a false god for many years. The strength I carried on his behalf was real. The power his army wielded was real. But it was in service of something that had no answer to the question this man just asked. I was freed by a question like it asked, at the right moment, by the right person. I am still free." He held Vader's gaze. "I serve no master. I serve a principle. There is no God in that principle. There are only people choosing, and the choices they make, and what those choices cost." He stepped back. Sidious broke the connection. The emitter went dark. The pale blue cone vanished, and with it the chair, and the hood, and the still hands, and the watching eyes. Vader remained. He stood in the chamber, in the dark, breathing, and the Force moved around him in ways neither of the two men across from him could perceive, and he did not speak, and he did not move, and he did not raise a hand, and O'Neill did not know what that meant. He said, "We'll be going." The Asgard transporter put them back on the Odyssey. The question was still in the chamber. Vader stood with it in the dark of the abandoned station, alone, and whatever the Force was showing him in that moment, he kept it entirely to himself. The order reached Vader's flagship within minutes of the shuttle's return. Encrypted, brief, direct. Destroy the alien vessel. All 3 Star Destroyers. Full pursuit authority. No further terms. The battle group moved. Carter had the numbers before the tactical alarm finished its first cycle. 3 destroyers. Shields at 41%. Compromised frequency. The Empire had been working with it since the boarding action. Adapted targeting would not take 14 hits to cut through Asgard shielding. 4, maybe 6 if the tuning was imprecise. Less than 2 minutes from first weapons lock. "We can't fight this," O'Neill said. "A fact, not a complaint. We can't run. They're faster in hyperspace on this heading." Options, Carter. She had one option, not a conventional one. "One," she said. "But it's the kind of option that gets court-martialed back home." O'Neill said, "Do it." The Asgard computer core had been building the targeting solution since the parley ended. Carter had the flagship's secondary maintenance corridor, locked below the bridge level, below primary sensor coverage, connected to engineering by a 2-deck access shaft along the port inner hull. The system could lock 6 biological signatures and beam them through active deflector shielding, through hull, and into that corridor with a 2-meter margin. She entered the coordinates. "On your mark," she said. O'Neill looked at his team. "Mark," he said. No alarm preceded them. Aboard Vader's flagship, the internal sensors registered the intrusion 4 seconds after it happened. 6 biological signatures had materialized inside a shielded ship with no breach point, no boarding craft, no prior warning. No protocol existed for this. The sensors were not malfunctioning. There were simply 6 living beings inside the hull who had not been there a moment before. Over 37,000 crew, and SG-1 had appeared in the middle of them. The maintenance corridor was narrow and dark and smelled of recycled air and hot circuitry. And Vala said, very quietly, "Good bones." Mitchell went aft, finding a junction and positioning to hold it. The briefing had taken 30 seconds on the Odyssey because 30 seconds was all they had. The flagship's hyperspace coordination system controlled fire solution handoffs to the flanking destroyers. Cut it, and the flanking ships flew blind. The goal was not the bridge, one control room, one cut beam out before the ship's internal response closed them in. Daniel stayed in the corridor with the portable comm unit open to the Rebel Alliance frequency, tracking biosignatures on a screen the size of a datapad, relaying positions back to the Odyssey. Vala was into the ship's internal comm system within 40 seconds of arrival. The Imperial comm architecture was layered, redundant, and designed to prevent exactly what she was about to do. Designed by engineers who had not met her. In Galactic Basic that had improved considerably over several weeks, she reported a secondary hull breach 2 sections forward with the calm authority of an officer who did not have time for this right now. 4 stormtrooper squads turned around. TLC moved through the port access shaft toward the engineering deck. Staff weapon collapsed, P-90 in hand, counting steps against the schematic Carter had mapped from the flagship's outer hull. Not a perfect map. Enough. O'Neill and Carter moved for the hyperspace coordination room, 2 sections off the main command deck. A coordination node was a communication relay with redundant power distribution, the architecture different, the logic the same, and she had spent her career finding the universal logic inside alien casings. The alarm cycling amber along the corridor walls meant crew in transit between response stations, 2 figures in non-imperial clothing moving with the flow, and no one stopped to confirm an anomaly that was not their specific problem yet. Vader found TLC by means that had nothing to do with sensors. He felt the insertion happen. 6 presences in his ship, force invisible the way the whole alien crew was invisible, not weak or hidden, but simply absent. He felt the one he recognized not in the force directly, but in the shape the force moved around, the quality of absence carried by a person who had accumulated decades of deliberate emotional architecture. He went to the engineering deck. Teals was at the corridor junction, outside the primary power distribution chamber, when Vader came through the access door at the far end, 40 meters. Teals turned and did not raise the staff weapon. He held it, and he looked at the armored figure, and he did not retreat. He said, "I cannot defeat you. I have no delusion otherwise. But I have stood in front of things that call themselves gods, and I have not fallen yet, and you will find that I am not quick to go down." Vader extended his hand. The force choke engaged. TLC felt it as a compression at the throat, not a grip. Something more fundamental than grip. His body responded with Jaffa physiology. 2 to 3 times human resistance in the structures the force was compressing. A pain threshold built over decades in service to a god who had not deserved the word. He set his feet. He was not trying to advance. The play was the corridor, the junction behind him, the 90 seconds Carter had asked for, and the fact that he was the one thing in this corridor Vader was focused on. On the bridge level, Carter reached the hyperspace coordination room and found it empty. The internal alert had pulled its crew to primary stations. She had 40 seconds before a secondary check would route someone back. She did not need 40 seconds. She identified both power redundancies in 11 seconds and cut them simultaneously. Physical disconnect from a panel behind the primary housing. She pulled the main control crystal from its mount. The 2 flanking Star Destroyers lost fleet coordination. Their fire solutions on the Odyssey went dark. Failover would restore partial function in 45 seconds. Carter activated her comm. The Asgard transporter locked 6 signatures. Mitchell from the aft junction. backing toward a dead end for 90 seconds. Valor from a comm alcove, the ship's updated alert, had not yet reached. Daniel from the maintenance corridor, portable unit in hand. O'Neill from outside the coordination room. Carter from inside it. TLC from the engineering junction, mid-fall, the force choke having finally taken him off his feet in the last 3 seconds before the beam locked, his body dropping toward the deck, his hand still on the staff weapon. The flagship's engineering deck was empty. The Odyssey received them. Carter called the drive before the last of them had fully materialized. The hyperdrive came online within 12 seconds of extraction. The flanking destroyer's failover system had not been fast enough. Vader stood in the engineering corridor and looked at where the Jaffa had been. 3 seconds from a full choke, the Jaffa already losing his footing. He went to the bridge. The coordination room report was waiting. 1 crystal removed, both power redundancies disconnected by hand, no explosives. No sabotage beyond the specific damage to the specific system that had been coordinating the other 2 destroyers' fire. Done with apparent knowledge of exactly what to cut in a room that had not been the target of any prior intelligence the Empire had identified. Vader stood at the forward viewport and looked at the space where the alien ship had been. They had appeared inside a shielded vessel with no entry point, moved through a crew of 37,000 under full combat alert, disabled a military coordination system using only their hands and their experience, extracted one of their own from a force choke mid-fall. Not because they were stronger, not because their technology was in any single category beyond what his engineers could eventually close, because they were precise, because they did exactly what the situation required and nothing more, in exactly the time available, without a wasted motion. The question O'Neill had planted in the abandoned station was still there. Vader was aware of it, the way he was aware of the mechanical rhythm of his own breathing. The ship was gone, and the Emperor had, for the first time in a very long time, ordered something destroyed and found it had cut his fleet and left instead. He told the bridge crew to prepare a full incident report for the Emperor. He did not add anything to the order. He stood at the viewport and thought about a Jaffa warrior holding a corridor for 90 seconds, knowing exactly how it ended. Not running, not pretending, holding the line anyway, and what it said about the question that had been sitting in Vader's mind since the moment it was asked. The Odyssey drifted in deep space, with its running lights at minimum and its shields at 15% and its hyperdrive operational, which was the kind of status report that could be read as a disaster or as a victory, depending entirely on what the ship had been doing for the past several weeks. Carter delivered the full accounting in the briefing room. Shields at 15%, the compromised frequency had taken more from the last engagement than the numbers suggested, and rebuilding would require components they did not have. 6 warheads remaining. Hyperspace core at full operational capacity. The Asgard computer core's analysis of the arrival anomaly stood at 31%, which meant weeks more of processing at minimum, months if the underlying physics required a new framework rather than an extension of existing models. She said all of this in the even tone she used, for reports that had no good options attached to them and were simply the facts of the situation. Teal sat at the far end of the table. The force choke had left bruising along the throat and a deep structural soreness in the chest that Jaffa physiology was already working against, the Tresinin-sustained metabolism running its repair at a pace that would have taken a baseline human significantly longer. He was not broken. He was present, upright, and paying attention, which was its own kind of report. O'Neill sat with cold coffee, and the expression he used in briefing rooms when he had already processed everything and was not going to say what he was thinking until he had to. Daniel said, "We should talk about what we actually did here." He had a list, not a formal document. Daniel did not write formal documents when he could walk through an argument in sequence instead. He laid it out across the table in the way he laid out everything, beginning with the thing that was undeniable and working outward from there. They had demonstrated to the Rebel Alliance that the Empire's technology was not invincible. Not symbolically. In a specific documented sense, a vessel from outside this galaxy had engaged 3 Star Destroyers and survived, had boarded Vader's flagship and cut its coordination systems, had extracted its crew and jumped to hyperspace inside a window the Empire's own failover protocol had not been fast enough to close. The Alliance had comm records of all of it. They had provided intelligence on the Emperor's psychology, that he was capable of being shaken by a question he could not answer, and that his first response to something genuinely outside his framework was study rather than destruction. That interest from Darth Sidious was a vulnerability as much as a threat. They had a communication channel with Rebel Command that had not existed before they arrived, and they had planted in the one mind in this galaxy most positioned to act on it a question about what the dark side required from the person using it, and what happened when that requirement became impossible to meet. Daniel said, I don't know if Vader is capable of acting on it." He looked around the table. "But I know that the same kind of question, asked at the right moment, ended the Ori." The briefing room was quiet in the way it went. Quiet when everyone had arrived at the same conclusion from different directions, and there was nothing left to add to it. O'Neill looked at Teal K. He said quietly, "You doing all right?" ETLAE took a moment longer than usual. "Vader asked me whether I had traded one master for another," he said. "I thought about this for many days. I have an answer now," O'Neill said. "And I serve no master," Teal'c said. "I serve a principle. The principle is that no being has the right to own another. There is no God in that principle. There are only people. Choosing. I chose." He looked at O'Neill directly. That is all it was, and all it needed to be. O'Neill looked at him for a moment. "Good," he said. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Vala found Mitchell in the corridor outside the mess with a mug of something the Rebel quartermaster had supplied along with 3 crates of assorted provisions 2 weeks ago, which the Odyssey's crew had been working through with the particular appreciation of people who had been eating military rations and were not too proud to admit that the unfamiliar, caffeine equivalent from an entirely different galaxy was in fact excellent. She leaned against the wall next to him. "You know what I've decided," she said. "Mitchell said that we're fine, that the rebels make better cafe than we do. And we have been to a considerable number of galaxies at this point." "That tracks," Mitchell said. "Existential threat does something interesting to hot beverage culture." He turned the mug in his hands. "You think we're getting home?" Vala considered this with the particular honesty she reserved for questions that she could not deflect by being charming. "I have been in worse situations than this," she said. "Have you once, twice, possibly 3 times. "I stopped counting a beat," Mitchell said. "At least the ships are interesting," Vala said. "The ships are very interesting in the Emperor's throne room." Darth Sidious sat alone. The Force moved around him as it always did present, deep, responsive to the quality of his attention in the way it had always been responsive, the dark side an ocean that had never failed to answer him. He was not thinking about the alien ship and the general from another galaxy and the question that general had asked him. He was not thinking about it precisely because he had been declining to think about it since the moment the holographic emitter went dark, and he had broken the connection and returned his attention to the concerns of the galaxy that was his. He was not thinking about it. The force, which was not Sidious's possession regardless of what his philosophy required him to believe, had noticed the question too. Not as a Jedi presence that tradition was nearly extinguished, its remnant a small old creature on a forgotten planet. What had noticed was older than the Sith and older than the Jedi, and allied with neither. It had been watching a long time. The galaxy's dominant note for 20 years had been fear, and fear was not interesting to something that had seen fear before. The question was different. In a Sith Lord's throne room, silence about a question is not the same as peace. The Odyssey drifted. Carter was at her workstation when the others had gone, the Asgard computer core running its analysis in the background, quiet and patient and indifferent to the urgency of the humans monitoring it. Through the forward viewport, the stars of a galaxy no human cartographer had named stretched out in patterns that belonged to no constellation in any catalogue she had studied. She did not look up from her work. She was not afraid. She had been somewhere impossible before, farther from home, with less, and the work had always been the same work. You found the underlying logic. You built the counter from first principles because first principles were the only thing that traveled across galaxies without losing anything in transit. Behind her, through the viewport, the galaxy turned. The Odyssey was not home. The Empire was not broken. The dark side was not answered. A question planted in a Sith Lord's mind was not a weapon in any conventional sense, and SG-1 had learned a long time ago that the wait between planting a question and watching its consequences was sometimes longer than a single engagement, and sometimes longer than a single war. They had planted the question anyway. They had been doing it for 10 years across 2 galaxies, in the throne rooms of things that called themselves gods. They were still here. Carter looked up from her console. The stars held their positions, ancient, patient, and attentive in the way that things are attentive when they have just found something worth watching. Something in the Force moved quietly through the deep space beyond the viewport. Not a dark thing, not a light thing, but something that had been here since before the Empire and would be here after it, and had just now turned its attention toward a single ship drifting between galaxies, with its shields at 15%, and its crew intact and its work unfinished. She looked at the anomaly data. She went back to work. All right, now that we've watched SG-1 beam into Vader's flagship and ask Darth Sidious the question that made him go quiet, I need to know who's next. Which character deserves to finally cut loose in a universe that has absolutely no idea what's coming? Drop your pick in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. If you want more crossovers like this, hit the like button and